this episode, I'll talk about the 3 filters that I use when I observe a horse or a horse and rider. And this is really highlighted especially when I meet a new horse and rider for the first time. It helps me see the big picture so I can best know how to help them. And as many of you know, the real problem is not always the problem that shows up most obviously. So we've got to dig a little deeper. So the filters that I talk about on this podcast are also the same filters I use with myself and my own horses to help keep me on track. These 3 filters will take the myriad of issues, of infinite issues, that you might be experiencing and kind of boils them down to 3 main categories. So it's really a starting point for diagnosing, and it can be a blueprint for development. So here we go, episode 30. The 3 filters. Hi, I'm Karen Rohlf, and welcome to Horse Training in Harmony. This podcast is about you making progress with your horse in a way that you both can love. It's about learning how to move and be in harmony. Because yes, you really can develop a horse to be both athletic and happy. When we show up as our best selves for our horses will show up for us. So, let's get started. So the 3 filters that I use when observing a horse or horse and rider are, number 1, foundation/partnership. Those 2 things go together. Second one is biomechanics. How is the horse moving? And then the third one is gymnastics. So those are 3 different categories, and they have 3 different sets of manifestations of how good partnership or not so excellent partnerships show up, and the same thing with biomechanics and gymnastics. So these are the 3 ways that I look at a horse to try to figure out where are they in respect to these 3 things, and it'll help me diagnose. And because of that, it'll help me start to solve. And when we start to see, an issue with a horse or something that we think needs to be improved, there's how the issue is showing up, which is what are we seeing and when do we see it? What's the problem and when does it show up? And then there's also the root cause of whatever we're seeing. And the root cause is always a best guess. And I think it's really important to know, no matter how much experience you have, and hopefully if you have a lot of experience, you get better at your best guesses. But I do think it's important to know that it always is a guess. And that keeps us in a state of curiosity and not just blindly going, it has to be this. Because I know I've been surprised more times than not, and curiosity is what ended up helping me really find the answer. Because everything affects everything. When we think about foundational partnership issues, often those are emotional issues. And that can affect how the horse moves and the biomechanics. So for example, an emotional horse might manifest as it crossfires at the canter. So we've seen this. The horse gets tense and they'll tend to start crossfiring. So is that a biomechanical issue, or is it really actually a root of an emotional issue? Now, the other way around can happen too. We can have an unbalanced horse become emotional. There was a horse I had in training a while ago, and she would become very emotional and impulsive. Sometimes. And what I started to realize by looking at it in this way is that she would become emotional more times than not on the right lead and be remaining calm more times than not when she's on the left lead. So when I started to notice I could predict the emotional state based on the exercises or what I was asking her to do, I said, oh, it's not actually an emotional issue. That was what was showing up. She was getting quick and impulsive and sweating. But actually the root cause was an imbalance, a crookedness that was causing her to feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know what my body's doing, and this is scary. She was sort of falling in the right lead. And so knowing that root cause helped me to correct the biomechanical issue, and then her emotions went back to normal. And so you can tie that into gymnastics too. For example, a horse who's spooking, who's having a foundational partnership issue, spooking, he's in fear, probably won't do their best shoulder in. And you can be riding a horse in a shoulder in a way that, because of the way you're riding it, maybe it's a rider has a lot of conflicting aids. Normal challenge to happen when learning lateral work, right? They're doing their best, but they're kind of conflicting and putting too many aids on. And the way that they're actually riding the shoulder in can create a negative emotional state that can show up then as maybe a partnership issue. So, this is where, I can boil it down to these three subjects. Oh, it's simple, these three filters, but it's still complex. And I think that's why it's important to boil things down to three categories to kind of give us a starting point of where we're going to start to solve this. And we're going to get pretty close. And then we have to keep digging deeper. So it makes sense logically that when you think of those three categories, foundation, partnership, that needs to come first. I think most people would agree you've got to start with a good foundation. Then, when the foundation is good, now we can start concerning ourselves with biomechanics. And then when the biomechanics are good, now we can start doing more movements and advancing gymnastically. So that makes sense. And if you're not sure if it makes sense, you can think of an exaggeration to make it more obvious. So, for example, who cares what the quality of gait and movement is while your horse is running you through a fence and taking off with you, right? So that makes sense. Like, we don't care how nice a mover it is or how nice his bend is while he's running you into the wall. Foundation takes precedent. We have to have a certain amount of partnership going before we start caring about how nice they move. It sounds obvious, but there's probably some people out there who have prioritized fancy movement and they have a horrible partnership with their horse. So if you're listening and that's you, keep listening. We got you. There's hope. And it makes sense that we don't care so much about gymnastics and movements if we don't have the biomechanics part solved. So for example, who cares how many flying changes you can squeeze in on a diagonal if he's above the aids, tight and crooked and stilted while he's doing it? Sounds obvious, but there are plenty of horses whose biomechanics are suffering because of the way the gymnastics is being done. And listen, I'm not going to sound all righteous because, hey, this is just the challenge of horse training. It's really hard to get it right. And this is, again, why we have to take the time to think about this, because it can help us not get too far down the road of having issues. So when we think about gymnastics, biomechanics, and foundation and partnership, even if you're really just focused on gymnastics, like that's your goal, you just want to get that dressage done, remember there are postures associated with mental states of mistrust, fear, boredom, confusion. So those are foundational kind of issues. And there are postures that go along with them. And the posture of a scared horse, or a posture of a confused horse, or a bored horse is completely working against the postures we're trying to do in dressage. So even if you think you only care about dressage, you're going to want to care about foundation and partnership. And even if you think you're mostly caring about foundation partnership, you're going to need to get education on how to ride the biomechanics and how to ride the gymnastic movements, because sometimes like I kind of said before, the way you're riding your gymnastics or the way you're physically developing your horse, if you're riding it poorly, or if you're not paying attention to using gymnastics to develop actual straightness, then the riding those movements poorly will cause biomechanical issues, which can cause discomfort at the least. It can cause restriction in movement at the very least, moving on to discomfort and pain. And those things left unaddressed will create a global chronic partnership issue, because how much fun is it going to be to go out and be ridden in a way that causes them pain and discomfort? Right. So everybody is always needing, in my opinion, to be thinking about these three categories. Now, the natural horsemanship / partnership based people out there, I found, will tend to diagnose every problem as a partnership problem. And sometimes they're correct. That is the root cause. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes the partnership is poor because of a biomechanical or gymnastic issue. Now, dressage people, in my experience, tend to think it's always an issue in the riding or the posture or the gymnastics. So if your horse is not in self-carriage, then they just need more half vaults, right? Where it might not be in self-carriage because it's scared and it's trying to run away or something like that. Or it's defensive, so it's blocking and braced. So this is where we need to really flow between and educate ourselves. I, as a Dressage Naturally, that's what I call what I do, I'm in the middle. And Dressage Naturally really is meant to be this bridge. It covers all the issues. So in Dressage Naturally, that's why I teach partnership and foundation, and I teach gymnastic development as far up the levels as you want to go. But the really, I think, signature concepts that I teach, and the part that I've really, I think, contributed, is this middle, the bridge from partnership. How do you develop your biomechanics so that you can move on to do gymnastics with a happy athlete? And, if you're a dressage rider and you already know about gymnastics, how do we bridge it back in a way that you can do gymnastics in a way that actually improves your partnership by understanding it backwards that way? And of course, the idea is these three categories are actually inseparable, right? So we start with a foundation. We need to bring that foundation and practice it in a way that improve the biomechanics in a way that honors and brings forward that partnership. And then we take that whole piece, the happy moving horse with a good partnership, and that's what we gymnastically develop. We don't think, oh, I got that one. I don't have to think about that anymore. No. We have to always think about everything. And this is where Dressage Naturally really, strives to not just be a nice theory that sounds good, but getting down into the actual nitty-gritty details of some of these exercises that are designed to increase the quality of movement, but in a way that works with the horse and that listens to the horse and that helps the horse explore possibilities together, knowing that bodies will naturally seek harmony if given the chance. And so this is all based on this crazy idea that things like balance and free movement and, those things should feel good to the horse. So we play with the horse to find this rather than just trying to make it right or correct or put it in a shape. And by doing it this way, by making sure that when we talk about biomechanics, we are actively employing the partnership, this avoids what so many natural horsemanship, and I'm just using that term, partnership-based, horse first, you know what I mean, coming from that end of the spectrum. Most of the issues that I see students like that having is they have this beautiful, trusting relationship with their horse, and then they start dressage lessons and it all gets really hard and it feels really forced and they don't like it, so then they stop. And that's a shame because we need to address the biomechanics and balance and gymnastics of the horse. And that's, like I said, it's my signature concept. So this bridge is what I call the sweet spot of healthy biomechanics. And I talk about this, the nitty-gritty details of that extensively in my book, DVD, in my video classroom. And I have a highly supported step-by-step course that actually dives deep into that. And we start in module 1 with the foundation necessary. And then we move through the protocol for finding the sweet spot of healthy biomechanics. And the last module is gymnastic, the basics of gymnastic theory and the 3 different categories of gymnastic exercises. So that opens up, we only open that up twice a year. It starts in April and October. So if you're listening to this podcast anywhere approaching April or October, you're going to want to go to dressagenaturally.net/programs, and you'll be able to see all my online programs. And one of them is the Finding the Sweet Spot of Healthy Biomechanics. So that's where I go into the nuts and bolts and the how-to. So for now, that really is the course that bridges these 3 categories, these 3 filters. I don't want to talk too much about the nuts and bolts right now on this podcast, but just I want you to know there's somewhere you can go where you can get all that. But I can still go on and talk about these 3 filters and give you some basics of how to start. So how do you know where the issue is? It's probably a question you guys are thinking of. How do I know? So foundational issues, foundation/partnership, would be things that would be inattentiveness, things like inattentiveness, fear, impulsiveness, kind of lack of ability to regulate themselves, balkiness, trust issues. And this can be, of your horse trusting you, or maybe you trusting your horse. If there's any kind of I don't really trust this horse, that's in the partnership foundation category. Issues with going, stopping, or turning, right? The basics, go, stop, turn. And then just how good is that? So for me, part of the foundation of my horses, or they should be able to do that bridleless. I should be able to ride around bridleless, or at least without using the reins, and have basic go, stop, and turn. And their attention without fear, things like that. Other issues that might go in this category would be saddling, bridling, grooming, mounting issues. Even if they seem, it's just a funny little thing. They just put their head up, for 30 seconds when I try to bridle them, and I'm able to get their head down and get that bridle on. For me, that's a problem. And it might be the first moment of a problem that is going to show up in your dressage. So for me, all of those things count. They're all connected. Other issues that might be in the foundational issue would be if your horse is arena sour or barn sour, things like that. So how do you know if it's a biomechanical issue? So if I'm looking at a horse, seeing them for the first time, and I see any of those things that I just listed, I'd be like, oh, there's some foundational stuff here. I don't know if it's root cause or where, but I'm going to sort of mark it in my mind. There are definitely foundational issues here. And depending on how bad they are, it might stop me in my tracks. And we can't go further until we address it. So for example, if the horse does not go, stop, or turn, any one of those things, if they're really not working, your dressage can't be good. If your horse is scared, your dressage is not going to be good. We got to address that. That's a non-starter. But if it's a little bit of, he's a little pushy on the ground, or a little trouble mounting, but it feels kind of isolated, we maybe could go on with things, but mental note, you've got to go back and address it at some point. All right, so how do we know if I can start thinking about whether I want to improve the biomechanics? So if I'm looking at a horse and a rider, and I feel like the horse is doing what the rider is asking him to do with the basics, that there's harmony between the horse and rider, So maybe it's, this is what I call the happy camper. So maybe the horse and rider are tootling along. They're happy, happy little campers, both of them. And there's some self-carriage on loose reins, right? So it's just a nice horse, comfortable transportation. But maybe then the posture isn't so good, or maybe the horse isn't being really athletic, or maybe there's energy level things that we can tweak and address. Then I know, okay, that's a horse that I can now start thinking about the biomechanics. The foundation and partnership is good enough, but wouldn't it be nice if they moved better? Another thing you might see is on a loose rein when the rider's just tootling along or equitating, there's nice self-carriage, but when the reins are shortened, now they start kind of pushing and leaning on each other. So that again to me would be like, the partnership's good enough. It's not a problem. The problem only happens when we shorten the reins and there's a little bit of postural compression and the horse doesn't know how to fit in there. So that's a mechanical thing. We can change the horse and how they solve that puzzle of being ridden with contact. All right, so then how do I know if I'm looking at a horse and rider for the first time, whether I can start focusing on gymnastics? So let's say I see a horse where the horse and rider are in harmony, moving freely and balanced. So bringing some of that partnership with us. They have working gaits. And for me, working gaits are the horse can carry their pole as the highest point in self-carriage and be stretchable. And that desire to stretch is what's filling up the contact and creating the round posture, which is a result of their general balance. So they have working gaits and they can transition smoothly from one to the other. Maybe they need, that kind of moment where it's like, okay, when you're ready, go from the trot to the canter, and the horse and rider can manage to get ready and make a nice transition. But maybe they can do that, but I'm observing that maybe in one direction, the horse looks a little stronger or weaker than in the other direction. Maybe there's some asymmetry in riding the figures, like, 10-meter circles are easy on one side, but on the other side, 10-meter circles are harder, or there's a little bit of loss of rhythm. Maybe the horse just in general is like, hey, that looks good. Now let's work on getting more uphill or more engaged. There might be issues with particular movements. Your shoulder in left stays on the wall, but your shoulder in right wanders often on the wall. There might be lack of true straightness. So the horse is cantering beautifully, but when he goes down on a straight line, you can see he's not quite straight. So those are all things that would be normal things to address in a gymnastic way, to prescribe exercises that will strengthen the weaker side or create truer straightness and alignment. So that would tell me if I had a happy little campers going around doing those working gaits, but I saw some of these issues, it's like, great, we can actually move right on and start getting into the science of gymnastic training. And keeping in mind that excellent gymnastic training should actually improve the biomechanics and the partnership. So that's another little checkpoint. Like I said, everything is always intertwined and should flow back and forth. I love the saying, everything should help everything. The way your partnership is should help your biomechanics, should help your gymnastics. The way you ride your gymnastics should help your biomechanics, which should just create a happier horse and a greater partnership. Now, it's a little trickier to diagnose things going in the backwards direction. So the logical progression of foundation and biomechanics, the gymnastics, that sort of makes a lot of sense. So how do we know if it's a how do we know if it's a foundational issue or the problem is showing up in a foundational kind of category, but the issue is actually, the root of it is a biomechanical or gymnastic issue? So how do we know that? I kind of touched on it earlier. If the emotions only happen in one direction or on one particular lead or during one particular movement. The horse is completely calm until I start half passes, you know? So it's a clue, because if you just walked in the arena and saw a horse freaking out, chomping at the bit and fighting with the rider and spooking at things, you might go, oh, that's clearly a foundational issue. You shouldn't be doing half passes. The horse is freaking out. But if you stand back and look at the bigger picture, you might say, notice that like, wow, that horse was totally fine until you started half pass to the right. So what's happening there? And then you can look at how that's being ridden in the half pass, or maybe find an exercise that'll make it a little easier and help the horse build some skills that they need. And you can build it that way and don't have to get to that emotional point. And it's really important to know, because if you always go, oh, my horse is freaking out, back to foundation, let me just go dwell, you'll never solve the problem, because it'll all seem fine until the next time you ride the half pass. So another way to tell if it's a foundational issue, but maybe the root cause is in the biomechanics or the gymnastics, is if the horse starts their sessions okay, but as the work increases or as the session goes on, it gets worse. Now, this is not always the case, but it's kind of one thing you can kind of look at. Does this happen? And maybe it's related to the increased demands. It could be this case if the negative emotions are location specific. Right? So why are some of the reasons why a horse might be arena sour? Well, because there's hard stuff happening in the arena. If you only ever do the gymnastics in the arena, then the horse is probably only ever going to not like the arena, unless you ignored it for too long, and then they just don't like you in general, and they don't trust you in general, and then they're not going to be happy anywhere. But often that's one of those little important signs that you've been doing too much hard stuff physically in a certain location. The horse is telling you, I like everything you do except the stuff you do over here. It's not the arena. They don't know what arenas are for. They only know what we do in them. So if your horse is starting to say, hey, I don't like this area, you need to ask yourself, what am I doing in that area? And they're telling you that they want something to change, that they're not comfortable. So it's not just a partnership issue, but what caused that? What are you doing to cause that partnership issue? And like I said, you want to notice these things, because if you ignore them, if you have that horse that's arena sour one day and then the next day and you're just like, come on, you're supposed to work for me, too bad, sucker, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, it's going to make a global change that will then, they don't like you anywhere, and they don't like you catching them, and they don't like you in the grooming stall. And now it just looks like this is a horse that's unhappy all the time. And then that becomes a problem horse or a bad character, and they get a bad rap. But the truth is, it started somewhere, and you want to notice that first place it starts. How do you know if it's a biomechanical issue caused by poor gymnastics or riding of movements? Again, this is how do you know if you're working backwards? So one clue might be your horse moves better when he's free. If your horse is moving better without you than with you, and it's a problem, like the biomechanics has been a problem, but then you turn him loose and he's fine, then you have to look at yourself and go, uh-oh, I think I'm doing something wrong. Now, a lot of horses, just because they're not carrying the weight of us, a lot of horses move better without a rider than with. So don't, beat yourselves up unnecessarily. But for example, if you have trouble with flying changes being clean when you're schooling, but you watch them in the pasture and they're clean, then you have to go, oh man, I must be riding it wrong. Like there must be something, I shouldn't say that. There must be something you could do better to help your horse out, because he can do them. Another clue that the biomechanical issue is actually maybe caused by how you're riding the gymnastics, is if you need stronger and stronger aids to get the movements done. Now that's always a red flag. If you're having to use more and more and more aids, something's missing. Go back and figure out what it is, because if you have all your aids on clamped all the time, your horse is not going to move very nicely. It's just impossible. So ask yourself, why do you have so many aids on in your shoulder ins or half passes? Of course your horse is not going to move well. And so go back to the basics, find that sweet spot where your horse can just enjoy the balance and alignment and freedom of movement, and start over. And try to notice when I'm starting to advance and do harder movements, yeah, we need to put aids on sometimes to help, but when do they start feeling like you're carrying your horse around with them? That's a red flag. Don't ignore that. If you ignore it, it becomes a chronic problem, and then it becomes harder to diagnose. Another clue that your biomechanical issue might be caused by poor gymnastics would be the issues, whatever issues you're seeing, go away after the horse has some time off. See, you take a 2-week vacation and you come back and your horse moves better. Your first few days are awesome. And then the more you ride them, the worse he gets. I know what this feels like. Now, sometimes that's a sign also that your mental work is going well. Your horse understands. So after time off, they actually feel just as good because they remember, because they actually learned it. But from a physical standpoint, if they feel the most free when you've not been around and their biomechanics gets worse, then there's something's going wrong. You're training, but you're training to a certain amount, and the other part you're getting in the way. And that's always the game. How do I ride to improve my horse and not make anything worse? Another clue might be over time you see muscle development that's not where you want. Their neck muscles are bulging in the wrong places. The horse is getting more losing tone in the areas you want them to be rounder, and they're getting hard or bulky muscles in the bracing muscles. So that's a clue. Another clue might be that your self-carriage is worse than it used to be. So hopefully you've started with self-carriage, mentally, emotionally, physically, and you've brought it forward. And then you start doing hard stuff. And then, now I have to hold my horse all the time. And I've lost self-carriage. So you have to have self-carriage good enough to use this one as a diagnostic tool. But if you used to be able to ride around on a long rein, and now here you are, a year later doing upper level movements, but you can't drop the reins anymore, and you're having biomechanical issues, I would go back and go, okay, let's get our self-carriage back. And again, all of these things, notice them right away. You want to notice these trends, because if you ignore them, they become chronic, they become global, and now everything's a mess and it's harder. And so this is, again, why it's so important to, as best you can, start by going forward. Start with that good foundation, with a great foundation. You want to know what your horse feels like when he's truly with you, when he's calm, when he's trusting, when he's in mental, emotional, and physical self-carriage. And you want to know what your horse feels like when he tries. And then if you really know what your horse feels like in that state, then as you start endeavoring to improve his gaits, and then when you have that and you want to improve his level of collection and the physical demands of dressage, we'll have a better chance of determining, is he saying, when you have an issue, is your horse saying, I can't, or I don't understand, or I'm scared, or I won't, or ouch, that hurts. Right? So that's one of the many important reasons why I want to have a good foundation with my horse. It's for this reason. It's like, I want to know what you feel like when you are calm, when you're trusting. What do you feel like when you're trying? What do you feel like when you're trying to figure something out but you don't understand it yet? What do you feel like when you're just in a bad mood and don't feel like doing something? What do you feel like when you're in pain? We need to understand that really well with the basics. So as stuff gets harder, we can use it as a tool. They can help us train them. So when observing your own horse, or for any instructors or trainers out there listening, see if you can look at your horses and students through these filters. What do you see? What's the state of the foundation of partnership? What's the state of the gymnastics? Of the biomechanics separate from that? And what's the state of the gymnastic development? And remember, partnership, the biomechanics lives within the partnership, and the gymnastics lives within the biomechanics and the partnership. You take it all with you. And now just some short answers for solving it. So there's no short answers in training, but I'll give you in a nutshell. Again, the book, the Finding the Sweet Spot of Healthy Biomechanics course. It's a 6-module course with 6 months of weekly live support. If anybody needs help working through this process, we can help you. But I want to give you something here. So in a nutshell, to solve foundation/partnership issues, actually I have a whole course on that, Habits for Excellent Horsemanship. But the nuggets, the most important nuggets you need to go in dressage are in the Sweet Spot course too. But in general, you want to slow down. Partnership issues, emotional issues often take time. There are not quick fixes. So you want to slow down. You want to check your own attitude. Partnership starts with an attitude. How are you thinking about your horse? And I want you to think about tracing things back. The problem is not always the problem. So whenever you see a problem anywhere with your horse, even if it's in your 1-tempies, what's the issue you're having? And can you trace back and find the essence of that same issue in its earliest manifestation? How is your horse to catch? How is he around food? Is he pushy? Does he knock you over? So it might sound ridiculous, but time and time again, these issues, it's all one horse, it's all one being. And whatever you're having there, unless it's an absolutely pure gymnastic issue, then you can solve it in a gymnastic format. But if it's something with, they don't trust you under pressure or anything like that, trace it back. When's the earliest moment you see anything resembling that same issue, and solve it there. I promise it's easier in the end. And to solve biomechanical issues, take the Finding the Sweet Spot of Healthy Biomechanics program. Forget the book. But in general, the theme is going to be to stay curious. I wonder why they're not moving as freely as they could. Experiment. You don't know what it's like to be a horse carrying a rider. And time again, the whole premise of the Sweet Spot course is based on experimentation, having a few possibilities of options your horse can try, energy levels, where they're putting their body parts, how you're sitting. There's only so many dials you can turn, right? It's got to be something around where their shoulders are, where their haunches are, how fast they're going, how much energy, right? So those are the dials you turn. And if you give your horse some possibilities of movement, the premise is bodies will naturally seek harmony if given the chance, and balanced movement feels good. So we play together, we communicate, and we play together. So it's get curious, experiment, give your horse possibilities for movement, and listen. Listen with your feel, and they'll tell you what they need. And then the nutshell for solving gymnastic issues. Well, we also have an upward spiral of successful gymnastics program that happens after the Sweet Spot program for anybody who wants to dive in. But for purely gymnastic issues, where the foundation and the biomechanics have been solved or good enough, then gymnastics is about getting scientific. Where's your horse crooked? Which is the weak leg? What movements could I do to strengthen that? Which is the stiff side? What movements could I do to supple? So you want to be scientific, and you want to be consistent, and you want to be specific. And that will get you going with gymnastics. So I hope that helps. I hope that helps people, especially those of you who have maybe some complex problems. You're just like, I just don't know how to make the breakthrough with this horse. Kind of stepping back and view your horse through these filters and see if you can take a best guess. And if you need any help with this, just contact us at info@dressagenaturally.net. We do actually private consults, so you can just contact us. It's on the contact us page at dressagenaturally.net, or shoot us an email. We're easy to find. And just say, hey, I need to talk to somebody about my horse. And the private consult is just about hearing what you and your horse are experiencing, and then we can help point you to whatever Dressage Naturally resource we think will help you the most. It could be a video that we have on YouTube. It could be recommending the part of the book DVD. It could be a specific video in our video classroom, or it could be an online course. You get to decide. But we'll just hear what you have, what you're experiencing, and we'll just help point you in a direction where you can get the information that you need. So take advantage of that. It's pretty cool. We love talking to you guys. All right. So I hope that helps. And as always, visit us in the Dressage Naturally Land Facebook group. We'd love to hear your comments, what you thought about this podcast or anything else. All right. I'll see you next time.